Morning, everyone. Welcome to this ABCI Institute webinar. And I would like first to, in the name of the ABCI Institute's board, um, which include, besides me as president, by the way, I'm Aloysio Lima Campos, the president of ABCI Institute, Renata Amaral, vice chair, and Bárbara Medrado, Lucas Queiroz Pires, and Márcia Pocherino, the other members of the board. We're all very happy that we're able to put this together, and we'd like to extend our special thanks to Jennifer Hillman. She just lost her mother overnight, and she spent most of the night without sleeping. And we offered her to cancel, but she's a trooper, and she said, "No, no, no. Let's go ahead." So, our special thanks. Thank you very much for participating despite the situation. And I would like first to do a brief introduction, and then I'll introduce the speakers and pass the baton to Lisa Schroeter, who is going to be our moderator. So here we are near November 3rd, when America will decide who will be in the White House for the next 4 years. And based on each candidate's declared agendas, what kind of trade policies we should expect in the United States. National polls right now, on average, give Joe Biden an edge of about 8 percentage points over Donald Trump. But recently, that lead has been shrinking. So we don't know what the trend is. It shrank from about 12 percentage points, so that's significant. So the only thing we can say is that there's going to be a very tight race. And if we look at the international trade landscape of the United States, it will tell us that there have been intensified use of tariffs and sanctions against key partners and products to promote trade policy goals. Trade agreements were revamped, such as USMCA, and there was engagement in several bilateral trade negotiations, such as with China, Brazil, UK, Japan, and Kenya. So the big question to our panel today is, will the idea of managed trade persist, or should we expect more trade liberalization in the next administration? With that said, I would like to introduce you to our distinguished panel today. First, Jennifer Hillman, a senior fellow for trade and international political economy at the Council of Foreign Relations, specializing in U.S. trade policy and law and politics in the World Trade Organization, international organizations, and Brexit. She has had a distinguished career in public service, having served as member of the WTO appellate body, a commissioner in the U.S. International Trade Commission, general counsel, and ambassador, chief textile negotiator, when we probably met for the first time.
Yeah.
Because I was representing Brazil on textile issues at the time. Then Stephen Vaughn, a partner in the international trade team of King & Spalding, who works primarily with international trade litigation and policy matters. But most importantly, he's a former general counsel of the USTR, and who was also a briefly USTR for a brief period.
Acting.
What?
I was only acting USTR for a very short period of time.
Well, nonetheless, a very important position. He managed a team of government attorneys and U.S. interests in both trade negotiations and trade litigation. So our moderator today is Lisa Schroeter. She's the Global Director of Trade and Investment Policy for Dow. Her focus is on trade policy and regulations, trade negotiations, and investment policies as it pertains to Dow's global businesses. She's currently the president of the Women in International Trade Trust and previously served as the Women International Trade President in 2018 and 19. Member of the Council of Foreign Relations, board member of the Washington International Trade Association, chair of the ICCA Trade Network and Global Regulatory Cooperation Task Forces, and the U.S. Business Committee on the Transatlantic Policy Network. I will now pass the baton to Lisa. She will be in command from now on. And so, Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alois, and thanks to the group for organizing what I know is going to be a really insightful and engaging conversation today. So ABCI, you've put together kind of a wide-ranging set of issues that we can talk about, and I know this is a very interactive and engaged group, so I'm expecting really good questions and comments from all of you. For everyone who's, I'm sure, very familiar by now with the technology, we'll take questions either over the Q&A. There's also the chat function. If you just go to the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see where that emblem is. Very easy to just type and send in your questions, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So in the interest of really diving into this, and I have to say this is a real honor for me to be able to moderate a discussion with two of my trade heroes in town. Both Jennifer and Stephen, as Alois was saying, have had long and storied careers, and their level of expertise is unparalleled. So I know we're going to learn a lot, and we're certainly going to have a great opportunity to engage. And to go ahead and kick that off, Jennifer, I'd love to turn to you first. And for all the reasons Alois was saying, 2021 is going to be a really interesting year for trade. As we think ahead to a next administration taking over, what are your opening thoughts on the key issues, areas that we should be looking at as real priorities going into a next administration?
Well, thank you very much. And it's really an honor to be here and an honor to join you and Stephen on this. I'm going to take your question as a sort of way of thinking about it as to how it might differ if we're in a Biden administration than we might be if we're in a Trump administration. And at the outset, I want to say very clearly, while I am an informal advisor to the Biden campaign, I in no way am speaking for the Biden campaign. Everything I might say today is completely my own views. So they are not in any way to be purported to be from the Biden campaign. But I think it's fair to say that what we would see coming in is a reassessment of whether or not the Trump administration's approach to trade has worked. And I think from my perspective, at least, the answer is a categorical no. If you look at it, again, has it resulted in a reduction in the trade deficit? Even if we agree or don't agree about whether that's an accurate measure, the answer is no. We are running a higher trade deficit than we ever have. Has it resulted in a stronger and more successful steel or aluminum industry? Answer, no. Again, production is down, jobs are down, prices are down, stock prices are down. So we've ended up with a weaker steel and aluminum industry than we were when Trump came into office. Has it created more jobs in the U.S. economy, in the manufacturing sector? Answer, no. We are obviously way down in terms of the number of jobs as a result of COVID, but the overall increase in jobs even pre-COVID was certainly, the job growth was not any more than had been occurring, again, in the last years of the Obama administration. So I think there will be a reexamination of whether we've achieved any of the goals. And then I think what you'll see from, if it is a Biden administration, is a reorientation. And I'll just mention three quickly of where I see the reorientations. I think first and foremost is going to be a very express recognition of the linkage between domestic policy and trade policy. Because the one thing that I think that Vice President Biden has said very clearly on the record is that he is not in favor of new trade agreements unless and until investments are made in our infrastructure, in our worker training and support, in all of the things that it will do to allow our workers to be competitive with those imports that are coming in, and with trade in this globalized world. And secondly, I think as part of that domestic agenda is a clear recognition of the connection between trade and the incredibly large increase in the wealth gap in the United States, where again, the haves are becoming, the top 1% are getting, a totally aggrandized amount of the wealth and the benefit from trade, and everyone else is not. And so I think that linkage between how do we address, that trade wars have become class wars, how addressing that is going to be one of the clear shifts that you're going to see. I think the second one that you're going to see is a sense that the Trump administration's go it alone approach has just simply not worked. The idea that America is always going to be better off if we negotiate bilaterally because we're always going to be the biggest, baddest one at the table is what's produced for us these tiny little mini deals that don't do very much at all. And certainly the go it alone approach to China has been utterly unsuccessful in terms of trying to bring about significant real reform from China. And the go it alone approach has had the effect of pushing away our allies. And so I do think what you'll see from a different administration is the notion that you're going to have to rely on allies, and we're going to have to start approaching trade problems from an allied perspective. And I think the third component of it will be a need to return to a rules-based system rather than the kind of power-based and trade policy by tweet and trade policy by chaos approach that you've seen in the Trump administration. I think a recognition that we actually need stability and predictability and rules, and that will include, I think, a real effort to try to reform and revitalize the WTO, but also to restore and rebuild trust. Because I think that's the last thing that's been clearly missing in the Trump administration is that our allies just simply cannot count on us for anything. The ink was barely dry on the USMCA before you saw these tweets about, well, we'll just impose tariffs across the board on Mexico because of immigration issues. Now you've seen the USMCA come into effect July 1. Less than a month later, we're imposing tariffs on aluminum on Canada, and we're reassessing how we're doing our steel reporting requirements coming out of Mexico. So again, I think that the general sense will be a restoration of a rules-based system of support for multilateralism and multilateral rules, support for working with allies. So I think I would expect to see a major shift. But at its core, I think if it were a Biden administration, it would be this emphasis on starting first by allowing our middle class to become competitive and to have the tools that they need to be competitive.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Stephen, how does that differ when you think about a second Trump administration?
Well, I obviously think that the Trump administration has been extremely effective. And I think we would see more of the same. It's nice to see that we're now all in agreement that the globalization system wasn't working for average people, that the average people were being left behind, that trade wars are class wars. That was all contested 4 years ago. Now we pretty much all agree on that. Should we be doing more here domestically? Well, the president did a tax cut that I think helped boost the economy. He made a lot of regulatory changes that helped boost the economy. Before COVID hit, we had an unemployment rate of around 3.1%. We had 3.4% wage growth in 2019. We have a stock market that continues to do very well. We have an economy that's coming back very quickly, even with COVID-19. So I think we did a lot to help boost the economy on the domestic side to make sure that American companies are competitive. I think the answer, it sounds like still on the trade policy, there's still a belief on from the Biden team that we don't really need to have much of a trade policy, that we could just sort of have these multinational rules and then American companies and American workers are kind of on their own to do the best they can within those rules. The Trump administration disagrees. We think you need a lot of flexibility on trade, just like you need flexibility in foreign policy, just like you need flexibility in domestic policy. We should have a tax policy that makes sense for the United States. We should have a foreign policy that makes sense for the United States, and we should have a trade policy that makes sense for the United States. And those policies should be made here. Do we negotiate with other countries? Do we work with other countries? Of course we do. We negotiated a USMCA. A lot of people from the other side didn't think we could get that done, and if we did get it done, didn't think we could get it passed. It was done in 13 months, and it was passed by an overwhelming vote of both houses. That wasn't a small deal. It was a very, very big change that I think gives North America the finest trade agreement in the world. Were we successful in making agreements with China? Yes, we've had China make the phase one trade deal with China, commits them to make structural changes far beyond anything they've ever agreed to before, and gives us the ability to continue pressure on them if they don't live up to those commitments. It's much stronger than anything we've had so far. Have we been able to get other countries to work with us on China? Of course we have. We got the EU to work with us on the issue of non-market economy treatment at the WTO, and won that case and basically resolved that issue. China just recently had a major diplomatic effort in the EU, and I think most of the press reports were that it went pretty badly for China. I think they are more isolated and more cut off than they've ever been, certainly more than they were 4 years ago. So I think our diplomatic efforts there have been very successful. Did some of these enforcement measures work and help make a difference? Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the steel and aluminum industries, we have hundreds of millions of excess steel making capacity around the world. And I think everyone, it's obvious that if you just hadn't done anything or hadn't put something in place to help the steel producers, we would have been overwhelmed. Look at what happened to Britain, for example, where they've almost lost their entire steel industry or what's left of it. Those are the kind of headlines you'd be seeing over here. You'd be seeing, major difficulties, not, the problems that we still have, obviously working through things like the virus. We did create more manufacturing jobs. We did have a really low unemployment rate. We did have a very strong economy. And even with the effects of the virus, if you look at it, the imports of goods numbers in July, there was reference to the trade deficit. Well, one of the reasons is that the imports of goods numbers have picked up faster than the exports of goods numbers because our economy is managing through the virus much better than a lot of our trading partners. If you look at our numbers in the second quarter, or look at what's happening in our stock market compared to what you're seeing with a lot of our trading partners, we're doing better than those countries. And that's when you see these kind of short-term changes in the trade deficit. But if you look at the numbers, say, from 2018 to 2019, there was a small decline in the trade deficit and an even bigger decline if you look at it in terms of a percentage of GDP. So I think it's been a very successful agenda. I think we've created the flexibility and the responsibility that we need so that our policymakers are making our trade policy. They're responsive to the American people. They're not having their hands tied by international organizations that do not have our best interests at heart. And I think you'll see more of the same in the second term.
Thanks, you both. You both mentioned China, obviously. That's one of the few areas of real consensus these days between Democrat and Republican. And there's a lot of agreement on concerns about China's practices, obviously a lot of differences in the approach. So as you think about unpacking a little from where you've started, when we think about the approach towards China going into the coming year, Stephen, as you mentioned, there's a lot of focus around the phase one, but there's a lot of activity when it comes to China enforcement, export controls, sanctions, BIS entity list. What's the next stage of that engagement look like in a Trump 2 administration?
Well, I think there's kind of two different parts of the relationship that need to be kept in mind. One has to do with the trade, the pure part of the trade relationship. And there I think you see the reports from Ambassador Lighthizer and from the administration they think the phase one deal is working. They're seeing progress in China. They're seeing a real effort to comply with that deal. And I think they think that's been a success. Obviously, you have some other things that are happening in the foreign policy space right now. Some of the comments that you're hearing from Secretary Pompeo and other people inside the administration who are very concerned about some of the activities taking place with China and some of the things that are happening kind of in a non-trade space. I think, interestingly enough, what's happening is that the trade part of the relationship in some ways is now the strongest part of the relationship because the communications between the two governments on trade have been so rich and so detailed and so deep in terms of the conversations that have taken place that I think that part of the relationship is actually working pretty well. So I would anticipate that in the second term, you would see more conversations between USTR and their counterparts in China. I think you'll see more professionalism in terms of working through making sure that everybody's complying with the phase one deal. And then I think you'd see whether or not it's possible to reach other deals. Obviously, all of this is subject to what could happen on the foreign policy side. U.S. trade policy always reflects foreign policy considerations. If we continue to have issues on the foreign policy side, that's going to affect trade. But for now, we have a situation where they've agreed to buy more goods from the United States than before. They've agreed to make huge structural changes that they weren't willing to make before. We really haven't had to make very many concessions on our side, and I think that's a very good outcome from a U.S. perspective.
And Jennifer, when you think about a Biden administration approach, you've mentioned the need to secure greater allies, more engagement when it comes to dealing with a lot of these controversial trade issues. How do you see that? How do you see a different approach to China?
Well, a part of it is, again, I think the Biden administration is going to look at what's actually happened with China. And I think the assessment may be, and again, I'm going to keep reminding everybody, I don't speak for the Biden campaign, but I think the assessment is going to be quite different from what you just heard from Stephen, because I think the assessment is going to be that whatever small gains we have gotten from this agreement with China, they came at way, way too high a price. I mean, if you think about it, we have cost our farmers their markets in China. We've had to spend $28 billion and counting to bail out our farmers because of the damage done by the Trump administration's trade policy. American consumers have been paying those tariffs on $360 billion worth of goods coming in from China. So there's been a huge, huge cost to the American taxpayer, to the American consumer, and again, to American companies that have lost their export markets. And for many of them, they took decades to build those markets. So it isn't as though you can just sort of get them back again. And part of it is, I think, what a Biden administration is going to want to do is to try to clarify what the goals are with China. Because I think if you look at what's happened over the life of this dispute between the United States and the Trump administration, it's very clear that nobody seems to know what the goals really are, particularly not China. I mean, one day you hear it's stop ripping off our intellectual property. The next day you hear it's technology transfer. But then what happens? The Trump administration says, well, actually, the number one goal is reduce the bilateral deficit, buy more American goods. That's all you really need to do. And that's the message that comes through. It's not clear whether the goal really was to create a tariff wall around the United States. I mean, again, we still have these tariffs in place, notwithstanding the phase one deal. Was that really the goal? Or is it really to push a full decoupling between the United States and China? And again, I think, the fact that there is so much confusion has meant that we have not had, in essence, a good result. So I think that the difference in approach would be, again, far more work with allies, because if you think about it, when the 301 report first came out, and it was focused on intellectual property and it was focused on technology transfer, and sort of in the background of it is the concerns over subsidies and state-owned enterprises. The rest of the world agreed with the United States. But when the United States then went to China and put as its number one goal, China, buy more U.S. goods, reduce the bilateral deficit, you immediately pushed away all of your allies. Because if the United States says you have to buy more American soybeans, it's saying buy less Brazilian soybeans. So immediately you have Brazil sort of on the other side rather than supporting an overall effort. So I do think first and foremost, it is going to be much more a work with allies approach. That work with allies could come in terms of more work under what was the trilateral cooperative between the US, the EU, and Japan that was focusing on new disciplines on subsidies or tech transfer. It could focus on the WTO in terms of a bigger, broader challenge to China at the WTO. It could come in terms of rethinking how we might approach the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But in general, I think it would be a very clear, what is the goal here? And to me, the goal is structural reform. Where I would disagree with Stephen is that this first phase deal did very much on the structural side because it did absolutely nothing about subsidies or state-owned enterprises or Communist Party control of corporations. So on those kind of the big structural issues, we are nowhere with China. And I think there would be an effort to make that the number one goal and to work with our allies to find ways to achieve it.
Well, Lisa, can we stay on this topic for a little bit? Because I think this is where I think we really should drill down on this. I mean, obviously, you can always sort of sit there and say we could have gotten more, But if you look at the phase one deal, they made 100 pages worth of commitments, detailed commitments, far beyond anything that they had ever made before. Now, Jennifer says we paid too high a price for that. Apparently, she just wants to lift tariffs. So that's okay. So if you lift tariffs, are you going to get anything for them? Are you just going to lift them unilaterally, just as a gift to China, and they just win and that just all goes away? Or are you going to try to negotiate and try to get something in exchange for them? And you say you're going to get other countries to work with us. Well, the Obama administration had 8 years to get other countries to work with us on China, and they were remarkably ineffective. And one of the reasons they were so ineffective is because other countries have very different relations with China. The way the EU interacts with China is very different from the way we relate with China. Germany's trading relationship with China is very different from our trading relationship with China. Same with a lot of these other countries. The idea that you're just going to go hat in hand to the rest of the world and say, hey, rest of the world, please come and work with us on China. Why? Why? Just because we're nice guys? Because they really like us? Because they admire the United States of America? We've tried that before, and it doesn't work. So I think it's a very, very difficult challenge. It's a very practical challenge. And I think the administration has taken an approach that has led to more structural commitments by China, more sales from the U.S. to China, more condemnation by China from countries like Japan and the EU, who had been relatively quiet on China before, and more isolation of China in the world. Those are real successes. Can we build on those in the second term? Of course we can. But I think to just throw the whole thing out and go back to 2015 and start that approach over again, I just don't see any reason why that would be more effective now than it was before.
Can I just one little tiny comment? If it genuinely is the goal of any of the United States ever to work with our allies, clearly something that a new administration wouldn't do is start out by putting steel and aluminum tariffs on all your allies. I mean, that is just immediately making an enemy of everybody who otherwise, the reason why, the answer to Stephen's question of why would these countries want to work with the United States, it's because they share our concerns over what China is doing. Everyone is harmed by China's overcapacity in steel and aluminum. It's not just the United States that gets harmed. Every steel producing country gets harmed by China's overproduction and overcapacity. So they have a genuine their own economic reason to want to join with any legitimate, serious effort to deal with China's subsidies and its state-owned enterprises and its overcapacity. And I think there was a huge outcropping, outswelling of support until the United States turns around and puts unilateral tariffs on all of our friends in the name of national security and tells all of our strongest allies, you are a threat to the United States. You are bad. We are going to sanction you. Then you have lost all of your friends. And then when you turn around and say that your number one goal coming out of a China negotiation is to reduce the bilateral deficit with the United States, you have doubly pushed away all of your allies. So I think there is a lot of room to work with allies because of the shared concern over what China is doing. The China shock did not just hit the United States market. It hit everybody's market. And everybody, I think, has a stake and an interest in resolving it. So,
Stephen, actually, let me go ahead and just drill down on that for a second. So, to the point that Jennifer's raising, and this would be a question to you both. When you think about kind of the approach, that is a fair question about the assessment of the goal here. And knowing that the 301 had a lot of really substantive issues to it, and certainly, for us, we've seen some real progress on the IP commitments, for example. So there were some real structural gains. I think that's a good given. The question of when you look at everything that was included in that 301 and a lot of the other areas, industrial subsidies, competitive behavior, et cetera, that a lot of that seems to be sort of phase 2 commitment. So I'm curious your thoughts on, by adding the purchases and sort of muddling that message of structural reform and buying more, do you think that do you still see opportunities if we think about the next administration of phase 2? Are we still getting to that, or are we still stuck on the number counter for purchases? And kind of similar to your point, Jennifer, about allies and kind of having our back in some of these conversations, especially absent sort of a strong WTO and the need with allies to kind of work on the reform there and also work on, kind of how China is fairly engaging. Do you really feel like we'd have that strong an engagement for the reasons Stephen's talking about? Everyone has their own relationship with China too. do you see that kind of a coalition, at a time when we're really lacking some WTO leadership too? Do you see that genuinely having an impact on a next round of discussions with China? Maybe Stephen, if you want to take yours up first.
Yeah, well, yeah. Let's go with that. I mean, first of all, I think the administration has been extraordinarily clear in terms of what it wants from China. It wants structural change. It wants them to change the way they treat American companies. That was the basis of 301. That's been the basis of everything they've said since then. Obviously, one way that at the same time, they want real market access, and one of the ways that you get real market access is through these purchasing commitments. I don't think it's been a muddled message for Chinese officials at all. I think they've always understood from the beginning that they're going to need to make these structural changes, and that, I think as everybody understands, there had been hopes that they could sort of buy their way out of these issues through these purchases, and the administration has made it clear that that's not going to happen. You're right, Lisa. A lot of this stuff hasn't yet been fully resolved. There's maybe phase 2 issues. That's one of the reasons that the tariffs are still in place, because the unfair trading practices are still in place. And I think it would be a huge mistake to simply just lift those tariffs and give China a free pass for what it did. And then I'll just comment very quickly in terms of working with the allies. I mean, Jennifer knows very, very well. I think she, from her time on the ITC and her experience in trade, what it's like when we have a steel crisis in this country, how disruptive that can be, how bad it can be for the economy, how bad it can be politically. We were on the verge of a steel crisis had the president not acted. There was absolutely an OECD effort to do something about it. There were G20 efforts to do something about it. Those efforts failed. China was not cooperative, was not going to be cooperative. And so the president had to take actions that he felt was necessary to prevent a steel crisis. And I think the idea that you're going to just sort of give away your steel industry in the hopes of getting other countries to work with you on China, I just think is a political non-starter. It was a non-starter for the Bush administration when they realized they had to save the steel industry, and it would have been a non-starter here as well.
Well, I'll just really quickly on the steel front. I think part of it is if you kind of review the bidding and remember where we were when the 232 tariffs were first announced, we had pretty comprehensive countervailing duty and anti-dumping duties on Chinese steel, such that the amount of steel coming in from China into the United States had gone way down. I mean, China had come from being one of our top sources of imports to way down on that list as a result of those trade remedies. And it was not the steel industry that was pressing for these 232s. This was not the case. Remember, this was entirely self-initiated by the Trump administration. The steel executives were summoned to the Oval Office and in essence told, you will support this effort. So it was not driven by a desire from the steel industry, because they had been using the trade remedy laws effectively against China. On the aluminum industry side, again, the Obama-Biden administration had put together an extraordinarily comprehensive WTO case against subsidies in the aluminum industry as a way to really say to the world, okay, here is the big, broad, deep subsidy case against China, using aluminum as the kind of test case example. But again, a lot of time and effort into making the case about why the way in which the Chinese economy is structured does not fit within the WTO subsidy rules, and how pernicious China's behavior is. And that case, again, took a lot of time and effort to put together. The OECD did do, and its contribution was a huge study that they did on aluminum subsidies and how they translate into the economy. All of that was put into a case that basically the Trump administration never touched. And again, so, I think a big distinction here is whether you believe that you can use the WTO and other fora. So Lisa, in answer to your question, how realistic it is, I think it's again, I'm not going to be Pollyanna and say, oh, yeah, this will be a piece of cake. If a new administration comes in immediately, we'll have everybody lining up to join this. But like I said, I think either through the kind of trilateral cooperative efforts, so again, there's already some efforts out there to join with, EU and Japan, so big allies, or alternatively, again, to think about a case in which others would join the United States. And I think a lot of people accept that there needs to be change at the WTO. The WTO cannot continue to exist with the United States and China, again, the two biggest trading countries in the world, having a major trade war that is completely not being done or handled or contained within the WTO, basically suggests to me that you can't continue to have a WTO system when the two largest trading partners are wholesale violating their WTO obligations, and all of this is taking place outside of the confines of the WTO. And, it's difficult because a good half of the countries in Geneva, it's, when the elephants in the room are fighting, their option is get out of the way. I mean, get out of the room. And that's some of what you're seeing is that, nobody wants to get in the middle of this fight. And on the other hand, I think there is an absolute recognition that you cannot have the WTO continue to allow this kind of a fight to take place outside of the rules, and you cannot have the rest of the WTO think that it can take a pass on this and somehow not get engaged. And so it will be, a sort of effort of, the U.S. leading and pulling together these coalitions and pushing on these systemic issues that I think is going to be the best hope to actually achieving something rather than simply convincing China to buy more American stuff.
Well, since you mentioned the WTO, that's a good segue into thinking about what the WTO agenda looks like going into the next administration. And you've already mentioned, so we've got an appellate body, a dispute settlement system that's not working. We've got an institutional crisis in terms of a bureaucracy that's not addressing these key challenges like industrial subsidies, like SOE competition. And we've got a stalled negotiating agenda, a little bit of progress on digital trade, but we're not there yet. So when you look ahead to the next administration, from a priority standpoint, how do we get the WTO back on its feet as a multilateral, really the leader of the multilateral rules-based trading system? And maybe to add to that fair point, Stephen, as you were raising before, should we get the WTO back on its feet? Stephen?
You want Stephen to start? Or
Stephen, why don't you start?
I'm happy to go first. Yeah, I mean, look, I think what we're hearing in this conversation today, these are big questions. There's a lot of very complicated issues here, and the United States needs to maintain the flexibility to make its own policies as necessary. I think one of the best things about the last 4 years is that the president has been able to highlight trade issues. He's been able to bring them to the attention of world leaders. He's been able to put them on the front burner as opposed to sitting on the back burner where they have been for most of the last 20 years. But that is all important. In order to make that happen, you have to have national leaders and nations talking to each other. If we're all just going to sort of wait for solutions to come out of Geneva, then government's going to move on and they're going to concentrate on other stuff, and trade policy is just going to be left to drift. And that's what you seem to have happen. I remember the early 90s very well. I was very optimistic, like a lot of people back then. The world that the WTO is designed to be in doesn't exist anymore. It turned out that the differences between us and China and the EU are much greater and much more profound than people thought back in the early to mid 90s. And it's going to be very, very difficult to have a real consensus between those three major economies, like so many of us obviously hoped would be the case back in the 90s. If the president is reelected, I do think you'll have very serious negotiations about the multilateral trade system. Ambassador Lighthizer has made clear some of the changes that he would like to see, both in terms of how bound tariffs work and in terms of how disputes can be resolved and things of that nature. And I think in the second term, the EU and China would engage more seriously on those issues. Up to this point, they've been very, very content with the WTO as it is, where they mainly see it as an opportunity to keep the U.S. in a box and make it difficult for the Americans to make their own trade policy. They haven't wanted to give that up, and that's why they haven't really been all that engaged with us over the last 4 years. But I think that will improve in a second Trump administration.
Well, I'm going to just start just with 1 second about this issue of the WTO not allowing the United States to make its own trade policy. Because if I read a lot of what Ambassador Lighthizer has written, and I think I've tried to read all of it multiple times, The most recent piece, is really focusing on the sort of, if you will, the unfairness of the fact that the European Union has gone ahead and entered into a lot of bilateral agreements, and that's unfair, and it doesn't live with, because of its violation, in essence, of the MFN principles of the WTO. And part of me says, no, just wait here a minute. If the EU is, in that sense, going ahead and making its own trade policy, I'm not sure that we should be blaming the WTO for constraining the United States, because we haven't engaged in much of our own trade agreements other than, again, with Canada and Mexico. We have, compared to the rest of the world, we have a relatively limited number of really significant, deep free trade agreements with others. And the question is whether that's the better approach or not. I mean, if I step back and think about, is the WTO sort of worth saving? And if so, how do we do it? I think, at least for me, the answer is a clear yes, that it is absolutely worth saving, because I think it's very clear that what we've gotten from the United States, just recently reading a study that came out about who's gained the most in terms of just overall welfare gains as a result of the rules of the WTO. And guess what? It's the United States that has gained more than any other country in terms of overall welfare gains by the WTO and its system. So I think from an economic perspective and from others, we've gained. And to me, the big gain that would be clearly lost if the system goes away is the fundamental principles of non-discrimination. And it's easy to say, oh, nobody will discriminate against the United States if we were to withdraw from the WTO, or the WTO would go away and there's no longer the concept of MFN or national treatment on a global basis. Not to worry, we're the big United States. No one will discriminate against us. To me, it's like, that's exactly what the Trump administration said about the 232 tariffs and or about the China tariffs. Oh, they won't retaliate. And yet everyone did. So I think we have to be really worried if we don't have a WTO. The countries will find their ways to say, okay, the tariff is whatever it is, 5% for the rest of the world, but we're just going to add a 20% surcharge onto all American goods because we can, and because we don't like the United States for whatever reason. So I think a huge worry if you really are serious about walking away from the WTO system. Having said that, it has to be reformed. I would totally agree with Stephen. We cannot simply leave it the way it is right now. So I am completely on board on that. To me, the big problem with the WTO is it's out of balance. You have, in essence, three arms of the WTO. You have its rule-making arm, which is really the negotiating arm. And there's no question that leg of the stool, if you will, is virtually non-existent. I mean, we've had only the trade facilitation agreement reached since 1995. There's just really a problem with it. And so we have got to revitalize the ability to amend, change, update, modernize the rules. No question. We have to strengthen the negotiating function. The middle function, the executive branch function, again, you have a small, but I would argue very, very competent set of people in Geneva. They have no power. I mean, they have, it's a member-driven institution. All ideas, all proposals have to bubble up from the members. So you have this very competent secretariat that can't really propose things or put things on the table. So again, relatively weak. And then again, until the United States killed the appellate body, you had this very strong judicial arm. And so the system was absolutely out of balance. And so I think, open for debate. I think most other people, and certainly me, would say that we were better off to restore the balance by raising up and improving the negotiating function, the rulemaking function, the executive branch. The Trump administration obviously have said, no, you restore the balance by killing the judicial system so that everybody comes down. I personally think that we'd be better off trying to reform the system by bringing all three functions up. And again, we can get into the details of exactly how you do that, but clearly on the negotiating function, you are going to have to go to more plurilaterals, and that there's no question that's going to have to be the way that you go. And the big question is going to be whether those plurilaterals allow free riders or whether they're going to be done on a non-MFN basis. I mean, that's going to be the big question. And I think we more or less know that more or less there's agreement that when You meet a critical mass joining a plurilateral. You can allow free riders, and when you don't, you make it like the government procurement agreement, that only those that are parties to the agreement get the benefits of the agreement, and everybody else doesn't, unless and until they're prepared to join that plurilateral. And I think if you could establish ways to do that, and then ways to bring those plurilaterals within the WTO, you would see an ability to restore the negotiating function.
Thanks. You mentioned the EU in there too, Jennifer, and I'm interested in following up on that point, especially as you mentioned. I mean, the EU has done a tremendous job reaching out and negotiating a lot of free trade deals around the world. They're also doing a lot, their Green Deal, they're looking a lot at environmental standards that can be promoted out into the world too. Yet we've got a number of lingering disputes, Airbus, Boeing, and despite the close relationship with Europe, we've been working for over 20 years now to get to a better economic partnership, and we've never been able to close that deal. So as either a Biden administration, a Trump administration looks at Europe going into the next administration, friend or foe, is there an opportunity to really get a much more comprehensive economic partnership going as well? Jennifer, your thoughts?
Well, I'm hopeful, but I think your question points out what a very difficult relationship we have right now with Europe. I mean, there's just no question. To me, the biggest risk in the next year is that in addition to our fight with China, that we end up in a very significant trade war with Europe, because I can easily see it. I mean, we've got tariffs ourselves on their steel and their aluminum. They've got their retaliatory tariffs. We've got tariffs on $7.5 billion worth of European goods as a result of the subsidies that were illegally granted to Airbus. The EU is going to be authorized soon to impose retaliatory tariffs on the United States because of our subsidies to Boeing. You have the taxes on digital services that France has imposed but held in abeyance the actual collection until the end of this year, on the theory that during this year we were going to get an agreement at the OECD to try to really get our arms around who taxes digital services, when, where, how, and how much. And I think it's not likely we're going to get such an agreement. And so I think this whole digital services tax is going to come to a real, head potentially at the end of this year, or certainly in early next year. I think the EU may follow France and consider a broad kind of digital services tax. And then you get to a huge, difference between the United States and the EU over issues around data privacy, data protection, data localization. So you have a real witch's brew of issues with respect to Europe. Having said that, again, we are our largest, if you put the European Union together, all the 27 now member states of the European Union together, they are a very, very substantial trading partner for the United States, and more importantly, a huge amount of cross-Atlantic investment. So in terms of how much foreign direct investment we have there, they have here, how many, jobs are going across the Atlantic, it is in everyone's interest to resolve a lot of these issues. And so, I see some real potential for a big deal, but it will, again, I wouldn't say that it's going to be easy, but I think that is going to have to be an important, sort of priority next year.
Yeah, let me say this. I agree with everything Jennifer said in terms of the problems. The biggest problem, though, from an American perspective, is that I think the Europeans are really, really comfortable with the way the global trading system works. They have very large surpluses every year. The system is very popular in Brussels. The Commission is very happy with the position that they have vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis the rest of the world. They really don't have much of an incentive to make any changes at all. And so I think if you go to them and you say, we're going to always comply with the rules, we're never going to do anything unilaterally, we're never going to do anything on our own, we just want to be your friends, we just want to work with you, now let's negotiate, I don't see why they would take us very seriously. They didn't take us all that seriously when we tried to negotiate with them on TTIP. They certainly didn't take us all that seriously when we tried to talk to them about the problems with steel and aluminum. Jennifer mentioned the aluminum case that was filed by the Obama administration. The EU could have filed that case at any time. They didn't file it because they're not that interested. They don't have the same concerns that we do. And they read the rules of the WTO, I think, a little differently than we do. So I don't know how you get them to work with us if you just show up and say, we're all friends, let's make some changes that you don't want to make. I think if the United States really wants to have, now I think if there's a second Trump administration, I would expect very productive conversations with the Europeans. I think they understand that they would need to really come to the table and take the president seriously in a way that they haven't been willing to do so far. And then I think you'd see very robust negotiations, just like we saw with Canada, just like we saw with Mexico, just like we saw with China. Hasn't happened yet, but I think they're waiting on the results of this election. But if we go the other direction and we take all of our leverage off the table and simply ask them to do us a favor, I don't think that's going to be very effective.
Well, another country that we've had a long-standing history of negotiating with but not closing, of course, would be Brazil. So for our ABCI audience in particular, I'm curious your thoughts. I mean, we seem to be making some progress at the moment. There's been a lot of momentum behind this idea of getting a mini trade deal done. There's also been a lot of concerns, particularly the Ways and Means Democrats, really flagged their concerns about negotiating with a country when there's differences on environmental and on social policies. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of regional discussions around supply chains, of which Brazil could be a huge part. The agenda going into the next term, where does Brazil fit in? And do you think that we can get some things done with the Bolsonaro administration? Stephen?
Well, I think the Trump administration generally has very good relations with President Bolsonaro. I think obviously he's often referred to as a populist, and I think there's a lot of overlap in the way President Trump and President Bolsonaro look at things. For me, one of the real challenges of the U.S.-Brazil trading relationship is that we have economies that are really very, very parallel. The top item on the U.S. trade agenda is often growing our exports of agricultural products. That's also a huge issue for Brazil. So when we negotiate with each other, each of us is basically trying to sell the same products that the other one is trying to sell, and that's gonna make things more difficult in bilateral negotiations. On the other hand, I think there are a lot of opportunities for us to work together vis-a-vis some of the other people in the rest of the world. We historically run trade deficits. Brazil historically has run trade deficits. We historically want to sell agriculture. They historically want to sell agriculture. We're very concerned about the fate of our heavy industry. Brazil is obviously, they have a great steel industry. They have an auto industry. They have a lot of these same concerns. So I would see a lot of opportunities for us to work together on multilateral issues and on working together in terms of how we talk to Europe and how we talk to China. And I think there's a lot of real opportunities there.
Thanks. Jennifer?
I'm not gonna disagree with a lot. I mean, I think there are opportunities, but I would basically take the premise of your question and again go back to at least what Vice President Biden has said on the record is, not going to start a lot of new agreements like that until and unless we get our domestic house in order. And again, I think your question also implied that on top of the things that would need to be included, I think for a Biden administration is some of the issues around labor and environment. And I think reaching an agreement with Brazil, a significant and meaningful agreement on those issues with Brazil would make it very difficult, and it may make it more difficult than is easily surmountable. So I would be less optimistic about an agreement, but I certainly wouldn't think that it would be an immediate priority. Now, having said that, I think there would be some immediate willingness, I think, to try to address the irritants in the relationship, particularly, the steel tariffs and this, recent effort to up, if you will, or whatever, lower the quota. I mean, to be more punitive vis-a-vis Brazil in terms of steel, when Brazil has not done anything wrong, and yet it's now being even double penalized under the steel by this huge reduction in their quota.
Well, speaking of labor and environment, and I know we're getting close to time, but especially to make sure that we're focusing on some of the positive areas of commitment, USMCA. Stephen, you mentioned it before. It's definitely a win. Actually, for the reasons, Jennifer, you were saying in the beginning too, the restoring certainty and stability, especially given the long-standing integration across the North American market. Interestingly enough, obviously both parties sort of read that success a bit differently. On the Republican side, looking at the U.S. manufacturing provisions in it, looking at this as a benchmark template for other negotiations, gold standard, as you said, Stephen. Jennifer, we see on the Democratic side a lot more focus on the labor and environment provisions, and really kind of getting to the core. I think, kind of as Ambassador Lighthizer has mentioned, what the Democratic Party seems to be focusing on. He's made some comments that maybe Biden is a little bit out of touch between his party where they are on trade. I'm curious your sense, that alignment of where, sort of on a broader Democratic basis, where you see good alignment with a potential Biden administration on trade, and especially how USMCA and some of those forward-looking provisions can help kind of advise on what would be some of the specific areas of interest for trade going forward, especially if we get USMCA implementation right.
Well, again, I think I don't know in terms of where they would go. I can only tell you what I've read that Vice President Biden has said, and that is, a couple of things. One is that the agreements really, well, three things I would say. One is that they really do need to have, significant and enforceable provisions around labor. And the question, I think, for everybody is whether that means, as we all know, the USMCA has in essence two roads on labor. I mean, one is the sort of more general sense of that our trading partners need to have solid, substantive labor laws and a commitment to fully enforce their own domestic laws. And so sort of one whole road that you could imagine a Biden administration clearly staying on is this notion that you have to have strong domestic labor laws and a strong enforcement mechanism for them. The second road in the USMCA is this individual company road of this rapid response mechanism, where if an individual facility even, and it doesn't even need to be corporate wide, an individual facility is denying the right to collective bargaining or the right to unionize, that just those more narrow labor rights, again, you can try to bring an action against that particular facility that could ultimately result in the barring of imports coming in from that facility. That one, I think, is harder to imagine a lot of other trading partners being able to sort through how that mechanism might work. The former one, I can clearly see as part of a lot of agreements. And I think the other part that you would see is much more engagement by labor leaders at the table, involved in the beginning, middle, and end of trade negotiations. I mean, I think part of what is really historic about the USMCA was the ability of that group of Democrats that worked with Ambassador Lighthizer to come up with the changes to the USMCA, was able to get the AFL-CIO to support the USMCA. The first time the AFL-CIO has actually endorsed a trade agreement since the Jordan Agreement in 2001, and we can all admit that was a really small agreement. I mean, the last time the AFL-CIO supported a significant trade agreement was in the Kennedy round. So, I mean, that effort that was a joint effort between, USTR and the House Democrats, I think is the idea of, this consistently working together to try to achieve real serious goals in the labor side and also on the environment side. I do think is potentially a new model, a new kind of paradigm approach, but it will start with making sure that you've got those environment and labor folks at the table from the get-go.
Well, Lisa, I agree with a lot of those comments. I certainly think that you need to have the labor and the environmental people at the table from the beginning. That was a key part of the success. Even during 2017, 2018, Ambassador Lighthizer was having a lot of conversations with those folks, and we're making sure that their views were being heard, and we're taking them very seriously. We have a lot of great opportunities, through the various ITAC committees and other ways of hearing these views. And I think it's a question of making sure that they really do have a true seat at the table. So I think there was a lot of good work done there, and I think anytime something passes the Congress with such a big vote, people have to take that really, really seriously. And I think going forward, any new agreement, you're going to have to kind of start with that as the baseline and then talk to the Congress about how far they're willing to back off of those commitments.
And you would see USMCA in a Trump 2 administration, USMCA staying as the template. How much flexibility do you see in that, recognizing that, if you're going to use that as a template, negotiating with the UK or Kenya, there needs to be a fair amount of flexibility in how those commitments get made.
Yeah, I think the way you do it is, obviously, the great thing about USMCA is that this is text that we know the Congress is happy with, and we know that they've already approved, and that's always a good starting point. Now, if you have a country like the UK, maybe they're willing to be even more ambitious on IP or some of these other issues, or services, for example, which is an area where I know, there's some real optimism in terms of what we can do with the UK. If you're talking to somebody like Kenya, there may be some unique circumstances where maybe the Hill is willing to make some adaptations to the language. But I think you start with that, and you kind of keep everybody on board as you're talking through these difficult issues.
Always a good plan, and I have to say, I promised everybody a really good debate. This has been a fascinating discussion. And as advertised, two amazing trade experts really setting the stage for what's going to be an incredibly impactful 2021. Eloise, I promised you I'd get us done on time too. So do you want to add any closing remarks?
Well, I just want to thank. This was fantastic. I think we cover all the major points, and we couldn't see a better display of what the divergent views are on U.S. trade policy. And I would like to thank you all so much for having accepted our invitation to participate. And Lisa, again, many thanks. Masterful command of this panel, and thank you all very much. And wait for our next one. And I will turn back to you, Lisa, for a final.
Well, I'm going to end by thanking both Jennifer and Stephen. You guys, as always, you've been so insightful and so candid in your conversations today. Jennifer, especially wishing you all best in your family circumstances. Know that we're thinking of you. And we look forward to doing this again soon. Maybe we'll plan one for November 5th. I know everybody's thanking me, so thanks for joining us. You guys were fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay.